Pnawn da, croeso, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Darren Hughes. I'm the Director of the Welsh NHS Confederation, and welcome to our webinar today, the implications of the Social Partnership and Public Procurement Wales Bill. It's quite a mouthful, the title, but we'll be hearing a lot more about it today from colleagues. Just a few housekeeping points before we start. Just a reminder to everyone that the session will be recorded and available after the event. Please could delegates remember to keep your microphones on mute. It's a mistake I've made recently. I was clearing my throat before speaking, which was quite embarrassing. And if you could leave them remained off for the duration of the event. There'll be plenty of opportunity for questions from everybody, but please could you put the questions in the chat function in the sidebar, and the mechanics for doing that. If you can pose the questions, I'll then put them to panelists. This is a Welsh NHS Confederation webinar. The next one coming up, a date for diaries, is the 12th of December at 1 p.m, embedding equality and inclusion. So another good, exciting webinar coming up. The Social Partnership and Public Procurement Wales Act brings together the worker voice through trade unions and public service employers to support the delivery of effective public services. Our three speakers today, we've got Neil Sermon, who's Deputy Director of Social Partnership Division in Welsh Government, Jess Turner from Unison, who's the Welsh Regional Secretary for the Union, and Sarah Simmons, who's the Director of Workforce and OD from Aneurin Bevan University Health Board. I'll hand over to Neil. The session will begin with a short video. Then it'll go straight on to the next speaker, and then we'll open up for questions. But if we can ask delegates to please turn your cameras off and ensure mics are off, and I'll hand over to Neil.
Thank you, Darren. Good afternoon, everybody. I've always wanted to say this, but roll video before I start speaking.
I'm a firm believer that Wales is a small, clever and connected country, and in my view, social partnership is a really, really good example of that.
Mae gynnon ni sylfaen ar gyfer partneriaeth cymdeithasol yng Nghymru, a fydd hwn yn gosod ar y gyfraith am flynyddoedd i ddod, a mae'n rhoi sylfaen da i ni yng Nghymru i fedru adeiladu Cymru gwell, lle mae yna gyfleon i bawb, a mae rhaid i gweithwyr a undebau a cyflogwyr achub ar y cyfle yma i gydweithio, achos mae yna lot o heriau gynnon ni yn y dyfodol, a fydd hwn yn fframwaith arbennig o dda i ateb heriau'r dyfodol.
Wales is definitely, punching above its weight. We are, I would say, definitely leading the way. We've got that future generations and wellbeing legislation. The fact that Fair Work is now going to be directly included as part of that. It means that we can actually start planning for the future, but it also means that we can talk about the here and now. We already have a race equality action plan for Wales. We have developed an LGBT+ action plan for Wales. We've got a disability action plan for Wales. Social partnership will mean that we can all come together and play a very key role as to how we now deliver on those plans and those promises and the recommendations within those plans.
The Social Partnership Council is one important part of the mechanism of the proposed social partnership legislation. It's the place where employers across the public, private and voluntary sectors and trade union partners will come together with Welsh Government officials to discuss, debate, consider policy and practice developments in alignment with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act ways of working. So all built on partnership, all built on principles of inclusion and working together and making sure that all people's voices are heard.
Un maes lle da ni'n gweld y mantais yna yw maes sgiliau. Mae'r byd yn newid yn gyflym, pa math o swyddi newydd yn cael ei chreu, a da ni eisiau sicrhau bod y gweithwyr presennol a gweithwyr y dyfodol efo'r sgiliau i fedru cael y swyddi da yma. Falle fydd y cyflogwr ond yn meddwl am trio cael gweithle neu ffatri fwy effeithiol, o fydd gweithwyr eisiau hwnni hefyd, ond meddwl am eu sefyllfa nhw yn y tymor hir a cael job gwell. Felly dyna'r math o mewnbwn pwysig sydd yn help i'r economi, help i'r gweithiwr. Mae'n gwella'r sefyllfa i bawb o cael llais gweithwyr, llais yr undeb mewn trafodaethau sgiliau, fel jyst un enghraifft o mantes y ffordd hyn o weithio.
I'm hopeful that working in social partnership will achieve a greater level of parity and equity across different sectors. No one organisation and no one individual has all the answers. None of us can individually make Wales tick and support Wales's ambitions. We have to work together, and having these principles enshrined in legislation will give added impetus and added requirement to all those different organisations to come together, and that's ultimately what the social partnership movement is about to me.
Fi'n gobeithio bydd y bil yn wneud gwahaniaeth mawr o rhan wneud yn siŵr bod digon o cyfleoedd i gwaith teg yn Cymru. Ni fel CGC yn annog yr cyflog byw go iawn o rhan wneud yn siŵr bod arian cyhoeddus yn cael ei gwario mewn ffordd sy'n rheolaeth a ffordd bod cyflogwyr gallu talu'r cyflog byw go iawn.
So all of this is about protecting the workforce. You know, what is it that we can do that's going to enhance and improve working people's lives and our communities as well, of course. We want to see, prospering communities. Social partnership will mean that people don't get left behind. And that is the beauty of all of this.
Right, thank you, Amber, for coordinating that, and I hope colleagues found some of that interesting. I'm not sure, obviously, how much familiarity everybody on this call has with the legislation. So my job is to introduce, I think, the framework of the Act and try and explain what it does and perhaps why it does it. And then I'll leave it to others, to later speakers, to give their own perspectives on what we have done through the legislation. The Act comes from actually a couple of places. In 2019, we had the Fair Work Commission's work in its report, which recommended, amongst other things, that the Welsh Government should create a team, a directorate devoted to social partnership and fair work, and we have one of those now. And there was a recommendation by the Commission as well that we should legislate to try and put social partnership on a statutory footing in Wales. That then became both a personal commitment by the First Minister and also a manifesto commitment by the current government in the last Senedd elections. So this was certainly amongst the top priorities of this government coming into government in the early days. And the pressure was on for us to deliver something meaningful and something impactful for Wales. The Act itself, if you I'm not assuming any level of familiarity, but if you turn to the Act, look at the introductory text, it's actually described as an act of the Senedd to make provision about sustainable development in accordance with the principle of social partnership, social responsible procurement, and by establishing a social partnership council for Wales. Ruth Mark's comments in the video, I think, hinted at that. The whole thing, this legislation, hangs off, if you like, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and the purpose is to use social partnership and the tools available to us to help improve decision making within public services in Wales, with a view therefore to creating better well-being outcomes for the people of Wales. And that's how I see the sort of logic flowing. The Act itself does four broad things. So it will create a new statutory social partnership council. Perhaps some of you on this call might be familiar with the work of the Shadow Social Partnership Council, which met very regularly and very frequently all the way through the pandemic. And the Shadow Social Partnership Council became the government's main mechanism for engaging with partners and stakeholders in all of our efforts to help manage through that terrible health crisis. And I think both ministers and partners and stakeholders would all agree that approaching a hugely difficult problem like COVID-19 in social partnership, using those structures and that way of working, was hugely beneficial to us and enabled us to be in a much better position in Wales than perhaps other parts of the UK. The Shadow Social Partnership Council was rather different to the new body that we have created in the legislation. It had a wider range of stakeholders on it. So the new Partnership Council will consist of representatives of the Welsh Government, ministers primarily, and 9 seats each for employers, that's public sector, private sector, and third sector employers. And we have made available as well 1 seat each for higher and further education representatives, since they're substantial employment sectors in their own right. There'll be an equal number of worker representatives as the Act defines them, but in practice, we expect those to be trade union representatives, because the Act requires the First Minister to seek nominations from the Wales TUC for the worker representative places on the council. We have just gone through a process with our partners of seeking nominations to the SPC. And I'm delighted to say we had a very good response to that request. Advice has gone to the First Minister, and he will be writing out to successful nominees relatively shortly to appoint them to the Council. We therefore expect the Council to meet for the first time in January next year. The Council's function, it's an advisory body. It doesn't have any executive functions, but its purpose is to advise the Welsh ministers essentially on the other things set out in the Act. So those are new statutory social partnership duties on public bodies and on Welsh ministers, new socially responsible procurement duties on public bodies, and also a small but significant change to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act itself. So for the first time, that Act has been amended, and we have replaced mention of decent work in the A Prosperous Wales goal with reference to fair work, thereby fulfilling one of the other recommendations of the Fair Work Commission that we legislate in some fashion in relation to fair work in Wales also. There was a substantial period of development associated with the Act. We undertook some fairly wide-ranging consultation. We consulted on a draft bill prior to the last Senate elections. We, of course, digested all of the feedback from stakeholders and the responses to that draft. At that point, we had envisaged setting out some fairly specific duties in relation to fair work in the legislation. But as we took forward the work to develop the final bill, we realised that the limits of the current constitutional settlement for Wales, the devolution settlement, it doesn't allow us to legislate for anything touching upon industrial relations. And so we weren't able to go as far, I think, as perhaps our ministers would have wished, but we have secured a place for fair work in the Act nevertheless. The social partnership duties, as I said, there are duties on public bodies, including Welsh ministers, but they're different duties. So the duty on Welsh ministers will be to consult the Social Partnership Council when it's established on the delivery of their well-being objectives as a government. Not the setting of those objectives, because the requirement on the government is to do that once a term in the immediate aftermath of a said election. And so arriving with a mandate from the people of Wales in response to that election, it didn't seem appropriate for Welsh ministers to be required to consult a very much smaller group of people about what the government's priorities should be. But certainly on the delivery of their wellbeing objectives, the Act does require ministers to consult the SPC. The duty on public bodies is to work with their recognised trade unions, or if they don't have any recognised trade unions, other representatives of their staff, in both the setting and delivery of their wellbeing objectives under the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And it's not just a duty to consult, it's a duty actively to seek compromise or consensus with recognised trade unions or other staff reps in undertaking those functions. Ministers wanted that to be a very active duty, wanted the engagement between employers and trade unions or other staff representatives to be very genuine and deeply embedded in the organisation. And we think that that duty, or at least we hope that that duty will achieve that ambition. As I said at the outset, it's about trying to make sure that public services in Wales and key decision making at the strategic level are properly informed by the views of the workforce. That's not just in relation to the impact upon decisions for the workforce, but using workers and recognised trade unions' expertise to help inform decisions about what an organisation should be doing and how it should be going about discharging its functions. The amendment to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which I mentioned, as I said, it's small, but we think it's significant because in the light of that change, every public body, that's those bodies which are already subject to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and those which will be brought under the Act at some point next year. There was a recent consultation on adding an additional 8 bodies to the list covered by the WFG Act. All of those bodies will have to revisit what they have been doing in relation to decent work and the A Prosperous Wales goal, and, if you like, re-envision that with an eye to fair work. And I have been asked what we mean by fair work in this context, and essentially our answer is the Fair Work Commission's definition, which is quite broad and allows therefore some considerable scope for public bodies to interpret and hopefully set themselves some ambitious targets and objectives in relation to fair work going forward. And there is finally about half of the Act is devoted to new socially responsible procurement duties. And that, I think, is again significant in its own way. My procurement colleagues tell me that there's around £8 billion of public money spent in Wales every year on public procurement. And that's an enormous sum of money, clearly, with which we ought to be doing a whole lot of good. A lot of good work is done at the moment, but what the new duties will ensure is that public bodies will be under a duty to consider socially responsible procurement and, importantly, to carry out contract management duties in certain circumstances to ensure that socially responsible outcomes are pursued. So by using particular contract clauses in relation to contract management, which flow down through supply chains as far as they can. And in the first instance, those contract management duties will apply to large construction projects with a value over £2 million, I think it is, but also outsourcing contracts. And we hope by those means to make sure that there's a much tighter fit between what is spent on public procurement and the socially responsible outcomes that will be secured through that expenditure, and also that those socially responsible outcomes are driven as far as we can, as I said, down through supply chains. And we've started with procurement and large construction contracts because I gather again that that's a particular area of concern in relation to current employment practices. So those are, broadly speaking, the duties in the Act. We have, we've commenced the relevant sections. The social partnership duty on public bodies will come into force from the 1st of April next year. And that's partly why we're engaging in this way with our colleagues and stakeholders, because we want everybody to be thinking now early about what that change means for them. The change is probably more significant for some bodies than for others. But we're anxious to try and support, encourage, help educate partners and stakeholders in any way we can to make sure that these duties, when they do come into force, have the sort of impact and effect that we intend, that our ministers would hope. There is a reporting duty attached to the social partnership duty, reporting requirement, perhaps I should say. We did, through the consultation on the bill, explore the possibility of some sort of compliance and enforcement regime around all or some of these duties. Ministers decided not to take that approach. So we've gone for an approach which focuses instead on scrutiny and transparency to deliver accountability. And the reporting requirement of public bodies in relation to the social partnership duty will therefore be to report annually on whether or not they have been able to reach consensus or compromise with their recognised trade unions on those matters, and if not, why not? And that report will go to the Social Partnership Council, where overall the picture, the performance across Wales and public bodies clearly can be discussed and considered with Welsh ministers. And there are various reporting duties as well associated with the procurement provisions in the Act. I don't think I'll say much more because that's probably my 15 minutes done. But happy to take any questions at the end if colleagues would find that helpful. Darren, back to you, I think.
Thanks very much, Neil. Great to hear the sort of detail, the intent, and I've learned a few things about the Act that I didn't know. But we'll hand over straight on to Jessica and take questions at the end, if that's okay. So, Jessica, from an employee's perspective.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. My name is Jess Turner. I'm the Regional Secretary of Unison in Wales. The perspective I wanted to offer, I suppose, is I'll tell you a little bit about what Unison thinks about social partnership and where we might go next, and perhaps what some of the challenges are and some of the learning points are that I think that employers, government, and unions can get on board with. I'm not going to pretend to speak broadly on behalf of all trade unions because there are many of us, and that's dangerous territory for any of us. But you might find that some trade unions that you work with share these perspectives or have slightly different views. But what I would urge you to do is definitely talk to your trade unions locally about social partnership and what it means for them, and to try and find ways to get into a kind of a space of a shared understanding. Just a little bit about me, because it kind of does shape some of what I'm about to say. But I actually came into trade unionism, I think, through social partnership. So I worked initially on Wales Union Learning Fund, WOLF projects in Wales. And I was working on them from the trade union side and running projects jointly through government funding with public sector employers and with trade unions, all of us working towards a shared objective of getting workers to take up opportunities to have a second chance at learning, using our kind of unique perspectives that we had to work towards the greater good, really, and to work towards a shared aim. And from a trade union side, for us, that was about giving workers trust that they could admit that they had shortcomings in their learning. They could use their trade union to get back into education a second time, and then we could be the conduit that worked with their employers to create the climate and the environment to enable them to learn. And we had tremendous success through those projects, and we still do, and Unison still engages heavily in WOLF projects. But I think that very much kind of sets the tone for there is a model of trade unionism which is about industrial relations, and that is absolutely what we have to do. But there is also a model of trade unionism that we're starting to develop in Wales, which is potentially something more progressive, that actually I think can sit alongside the industrial modes of what we have to do as well. And I think that's very much typified by WOLF. I've also had experience of working with Neil, who you just saw directly. I've been a trade union secondee into Welsh Government, where I've worked in the Social Partnership Directorate at a time when this legislation was developing. And within the directorate, that kind of, it shifted my thinking in terms of the work that kind of goes on behind the scenes and getting an understanding of that, but also breaking down some of the barriers that naturally exist between our organisations. So between trade unions, I worked with employer secondees, I worked with government officials, and I worked with other trade unions as well as part of that process. And that experience taught me quite a lot about what it's going to take, I think, for legislation like this to succeed in the long term. Just in terms of my kind of union's position and Unison's position on social partnership, Neil alluded to points of the Act that could potentially have gone further, and yes, there would have been more we'd have liked to have seen in terms of enforcement and sort of beefing up the Fair Work agenda. But we did, we did understand throughout the process that there would be, restrictions on us in Wales that potentially meant there were areas of industrial relations that we would like to go near that we couldn't. So for us now in Unison, it's about getting on board with the Social Partnership and Public Procurement Act and seeing what we can make of it. And I think, as Shav said from the Wales TUC in the video, we think this gets to punch above our weight in Wales, and we think it firmly puts Wales on the map and marks us out as a progressive nation that's prepared to put worker voice at the heart of organisational decision making. And from you know, us as a trade union, we're absolutely on board with that. I also think for us, social partnership more broadly is another way that trade unions can support the workforce in redressing that power imbalance that naturally exists. So by taking worker voice so seriously and involving workers in decision making through public organisations, it addresses that natural employer-employee imbalance that we see as part of the reason why people join trade unions. And, you know, I probably don't need to go into in a sphere like this how, you know, value and listening to the workforce makes the workforce feel you know, makes for a kind of happier, more content workforce. I want to address a couple of points about the health sphere. I do think in health we have this idea, and I don't know in terms of this audience here if this is something you experience or not, but there's this idea that we've been doing social partnership in health for a long time, and I think with that comes some positives and potentially some pitfalls. I think there has been a strong sense of a social partnership ideology from the top, particularly at that tripartite level. My union engages very heavily in that, as do other health trade unions. And there is definitely, having worked across the public sector in my time in Unison, there is definitely more of a sense of a partnership agenda, I would say, at workforce level and through LPFs and so on. And I think that's great. I think that gives us a solid foundation to really look at this legislation and think, where can we take it? And I think that means that for me, the NHS in Wales and health has to be the kind of vanguard for social partnership, because, you know, we actually have you know, a public institution here at a time when faith in public institutions across the UK is waning, that the public do broadly support, that they want to succeed, and actually a public sector workforce that the public support. You know, nobody ever says we need fewer nurses. And I think that means that it's incumbent upon us to take this extra responsibility to work together to really make social partnership work and embed this legislation in NHS organisations in Wales. Because I also think that because we've been doing it for a while, we might have established ways of doing things and think, well, actually, all this legislation does is potentially tick a box that we had ticked a long time ago. And my challenge, I guess, to us as trade unions and to employer organisations and to government at tripartite level is to say, how do we take the legislation and make what we do better? How do we really embed that worker voice, for instance, in organisational decision making, and the you know, the setting of wellbeing objectives, not just because we have to report on it, but because it is absolutely the right thing to do. I think some of the positives in the NHS sphere are the fact that there exists a kind of almost like a pyramid, you would think, if it was all working perfectly, and some collective terms and conditions. I think that makes things sort of easier in the NHS sphere. I think where we could develop further is obviously, as a trade union side, we need to look at how unions work together collectively, and we always need to assess how things work on the ground in the more kind of local employer partnership spheres. But for me, I think it's incumbent on all of us to challenge ourselves to look at this new legislation and say, right, well, there may be things we're already doing, but how do we make this better? And for me, how do we further embed that worker voice through trade unions in the decisions that we're making? I just briefly want to touch on where it doesn't sort of sometimes work so well, and I think we just need to look back at the beginning of the year and the sort of the industrial unrest that we had, not just in health but also in education in Wales. And one argument that was being kind of put forward at that time is, well, where's this social partnership then? And, you know, I was in those kind of discussions myself, and you can feel an acute sense of frustration when workers are coming to the trade union and saying, we need more, we can't live on the wages that we've got, and we need to fight for that if it's not going to be given to us. But what I would say is that was a real test for a social partnership model of working, where, you know, actually our notion that we were working towards a shared objective kind of slightly went off a bit. But what we had in place at the time was a framework for discussion. And I think social partnership can also help in that regard. It can help set that framework and set those conditions in which we can reasonably discuss things and we can start to get back around the table. So while social partnership is not industrial relations, I think the two can coexist. And I do think the frameworks and the trust and the respect that we create in those social partnership relationships can aid the difficult industrial times that we have to navigate. And actually, health and education both went through, a period of industrial unrest at the start of the year, and both social partnership structures at a tripartite level have continued, and those structures have been used even to work through aspects of various pay deals. I'm not going to create a sort of a future perfect here and say, we've got the legislation, let's tick the box, off we go. We should all behave perfectly. I think there's probably a conversation to be had at many levels about behaviours within a social partnership structure. We're all human beings at the end of the day, and organisations are going to bring in their different objectives and their different actors to work together. I think the most important thing is that we set the framework right, and then it should be that anyone within that from the different organisations can operate. But we have to deal with the development of this agenda over time, and I think it's incumbent on all of us to do that. I just want to say a word about training. I think it's an entirely different skill. We train union representatives, as I'm sure all unions do, and we train them to be union reps. But it's a different skill to operate in a social partnership model and to look into some of these things like, some of our reps at first didn't know what we were talking about when we started talking about fair work a few years ago. Now it's much higher on the agenda, but we had to go through, and deconstruct what fair work meant. We have to talk now about what the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act means, and actually what the role of trade unions is in being the worker voice and how you influence that. So for us, we're thinking about, new training packages for trade union reps about how you engage within a social partnership sphere. And just as we're thinking about it, we would hope that that's happening on the employer side too, and that, some thought is going into how we all need to develop further. My final point, well, I suppose I'm taking advantage of having you here, really, but as part of that development, I really do think we can't neglect trade union facility time at the moment. And I know that, within the NHS, we do have some reasonable facility time arrangements. But I do think that if trade union reps are going to be given proper time to plan, research, prepare, understand what their role is in engaging, sometimes probably now reading much kind of more in-depth documents and other things that they wouldn't have had to be involved in before, that we can't neglect that trade unions need facility time in order to do this. And that part is in the gift of the employer. But just to conclude, our union is committed to making this act work. This hasn't ended by getting the legislation and the piece of paper through government. This actually starts now. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jess. And my favourite challenge is always, how can you make it better, which is a question you've asked of all of us, and we shouldn't rest on our laurels. I'll hand over to Sarah Simmons from an Iron Bevan. Sarah.
Prynawn da, diolch, Darren. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes really in terms of social partnership from our perspective in an Iron Bevan University Health Board. And it follows quite nicely from Jess's talk really in terms of how we're set up. I do think we have a robust and well embedded structure and infrastructure around working in partnership. Not only do we have a well embedded and recognised trade union partnership agreement where we recognise 13 trade unions in terms of consultation and negotiation, that also reinforces the core principles of social partnership in terms of that joint commitment, that transparency, integrity, openness, and the need to recognise and respect the mutual obligations that we have, as well as the elements of fair work. We also have a governance infrastructure which firmly supports working in social partnership. Not only as other health boards and NHS organisations do we have independent members that represent the views of trade unions on the board, we also have an annual report from our trade union lead, which is reported into board, and that is as honest as it comes and very much in the interests of improving our relationship. Our Trade Union Partnership Forum is very well established and has really good attendance from management and staff side representation, and is of course a subcommittee of our board. We also have strong connections with the BMA through an LNC arrangement. And both of those committees have a core agenda. And I'm really pleased to say that those agenda items are not dominated by workforce issues. They are robustly entrenched in time for considering our planning. So whether that's planning from a local employer's perspective in terms of how we plan our IMTP, any service changes. There is also around any regional and national planning that will affect the health board services and the health board employees. We also look very heavily in the agenda in terms of finance. Again, transparency and very much in terms of recent times has enabled us to make difficult decisions together and respect those decisions through the partnership framework. And we also use that route to understand and support and approve our core strategies. So some more recent strategies which have had a lot of discussion and involvement through partnership working have been our people plan, so our workforce and OD strategy, and also our nursing workforce strategy, which looks at addressing some of those key workforce issues. In terms of the core agenda, it is heavily weighted as well in terms of equality, diversity and inclusion, and that encompasses a range of actions and strategies in terms of inclusivity, widening access, and really looking at that fair work opportunity, as well as considerations in terms of bullying and harassment and other voices that we need to hear through the partnership arena. In support of the Trade Union Partnership Forum, we also facilitate and enable a range of groups and networks which really involve trade union colleagues in terms of the planning and key agenda items. So many of you will be aware that a couple of years ago, we opened the Grange University Hospital. The planning and infrastructure that went into that was most certainly enabled by a workforce and OD partnership group, which was heavily attended by staff side colleagues, but also very much supported by our operational management. And through there, we planned each service change, looked at workforce plans in detail, understood what that would mean for our staff, how they would work, where they would work, and also what it would mean for our future workforce strategies and how we would deliver services to our patients. And that was a very effective group in terms of ensuring that we planned, had open and honest communications, and also understood the mutual gains that would come through those changes. And I'm pleased to say that we've just resurrected that group in slightly different format, but with the same successful principles in understanding how we will deliver our 6 priority programmes as a health board. We also have a range of groups which look at voice and participation. Another example is our Agile Working Group, which is heavily attended by our staff side colleagues. As well as the formal infrastructure and governance mechanisms, we also support a range of informal mechanisms to discuss, look at joint problem solving. So some examples are we regularly hold informal development sessions, and we've most recently used those sessions to tackle some really wicked issues. So we've had a joint problem solving session to look at how we're applying and interpreting disciplinary and respect and resolution policies through grievances. And we've been able, through open communication, really looking at some examples of what's gone wrong and what's gone right, to really reinvent our approach to employee relations. And that's been done with the full support of our trade union colleagues. Still more work to do, but we've been able to make great progress. We've also held sessions in terms of looking at agency reduction, which is a core issue for many of our colleagues across Wales at this moment in time. And that's been helpful to really tackle some of the myths, tackle some of the barriers in terms of supporting sustainable workforce solutions. And we've also more recently held an in-depth session really looking at how we can improve partnership working. When I first came into post some time ago, there were specific issues where things weren't going so well. We had an issue with some agile working space, which caused a lot of dissatisfaction among staff, and we had to resolve that quite quickly. And as part of that, we set up this informal session to look at how we could work differently. And through there, some of our improvement actions, which I'll go into in a little while, have been enabled. I will also build on the point that Jess mentioned around behaviours. So personal relationships and behaviours are key, I think, to the success of making it work, and really embedding that respect and trust, which is so central to effective social partnership. And in terms of preparing for this session today, I did ask some of my staff side colleagues for some feedback in terms of how do you think we're doing in terms of social partnership? And generally the feedback is really positive, in that there's a strong commitment within the organisation, and we're really keen in terms of working on the agenda and working collectively to make it to improve and make it a true possibility. There's a strong level of trust, especially among senior level, but more work to do, I think, in terms of embedding that through the organisation. Through some of our sessions in terms of how we can improve, we've identified some areas which we need to improve on. Some of that includes setting up divisional partnership forums, so making sure that we embed that partnership working through not vertically and horizontally across the organisation. And over the recent months, we've been able to set that up in most divisions. We've been able to have a list of who's who, so people know who to go to in terms of management and staff side representatives, which can sometimes get lost when you're working in such a large organisation. We've been able to get commitment to shared terms of reference for those local partnership forum. And also, building on Jess's point, being able to secure that time off to attend those partnership forums. Time off for duties continues to be a challenge, but I think is definitely one we should remain committed to. Communication can be an issue across the organisation. You know, with 16,000 employees, various sites and various departments, cultures and teams, it can be difficult to get a consistent message across. So we continuously work on improving our communication strategy, and I've recently worked with our communications teams and launched a strategy which again was supported and approved through our trade union partnership forum. Policy application and interpretation, I think, is key in terms of building that trust, and we continue to work on that. And also work in partnership in terms of our support for colleagues to speak up, and have made some progress in this area in recent months. As well as time off for duties, something I think we really need to focus on is succession planning for trade union reps. We know we've got many who are reaching retirement age. We haven't got as many volunteers coming through. So it's definitely something I think organisations need to consider as we move forward. And how do we know whether we're getting it right or wrong? I think colleagues are really quick to tell us when we're getting it wrong, and I think that's positive, and we welcome those opportunities. We've had some examples where we get it right, and the themes within that are always about early engagement, early involvement in the planning stages, transparent staff communication, consistency of behaviour, a willingness to listen, and time to uphold our principles. Where we get it wrong, it's mainly around themes of us acting in haste, maybe think we're doing the right thing, and actually don't consider some of the implications that we might not have thought about. So sometimes assume it's a good idea, on paper it probably is a good idea, and people agree it's a good idea, but without taking the time to actually explore that, it does come across as a failure to listen. And I think getting that wrong takes an awful lot of energy, rather than when you get it right. So we continue to work in partnership with colleagues, continue to look for those mutual gains. And just to finish, I just want to highlight a couple of few things we've worked on in terms of partnership working, which took quite an amount of time to get agreed, but actually that early engagement in the planning stages, being able to dispel any fears, has really supported us to have a positive impact. So you wouldn't, maybe some colleagues in the call wouldn't expect it, but it was really difficult to get an agreed approach to our apprenticeship scheme. But now we're on our third cohort and able to recruit to that annually. I think there was a big distrust in terms of what an apprenticeship scheme would look like, but with early engagement and early involvement in planning with agreement, we've been able to embed that across the organisation. And something really positive is our engagement with staff side on the EDI agenda, with a trade union lead, funded time for them to support us on that agenda. And I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much to Sarah, Jess and Neil for your presentations. And I think if I was clever enough to do a word cloud, I think the words around improvement and partnership and the need for good communication have come out from all of you, the pointers towards early involvement. We've got about 10 minutes for questions, so I'll ask a reminder to panelists it's only 10 minutes left for questions, so it could be as concise as you can, but also a reminder to delegates to get your questions in early, because I'm definitely one of those people who will wait and think, wish I'd asked that question, so now is your opportunity. We've already got some questions in the sidebar. First one is, and thanks to my colleague Eula for collating the questions. What is Unison doing to prepare its own activists for the implementation of the Act? So I'll come to Jess.
Oh, hi. Yeah. So the first thing to say on that is the team Wales TUC are actually piloting some training on social partnership. So we're watching that very closely, and we'll see what we can glean from that and how we want to use it. And then we're also thinking about our own internal training, education and guidance documents about what the Act means and what engagement under the Act means. So a lot.
Excellent, thank you for it. And the second one, helpfully for you as well, but actually Neil's got a hand up. Neil, do you want to come in?
Yes, just to follow on from Jess's point, my team, I have a comms and engagement team, and they've been doing a lot of work. We've had lots of meetings and stakeholder engagement sessions across Wales. So we're taking the learning from that to inform the work that we're trying to do to support not just our trade union partners, but also our employer partners in implementing these new duties. So more comms work, more engagement, some training on offer. We're looking at what guidance we can provide centrally as well. So all of that's in hand, and we'll be taking that forward in social partnership as we do everything else at the moment.
Excellent, thanks very much, Neil. The next question is towards Jess, but I'll ask either Neil and Sarah to come in as well. The question was on unions having the capacity to take the work forward in a meaningful way, and Neil's alluded to some of that already. But Sarah, just thinking as well from your perspective, the health board you work in employs 16,000 people, so a lot of work to make this actually work on the ground. But I'll come to Jess first, then to Neil and Sarah for comments.
Yeah, I can be quite concise. I mean, there are no sort of, there are no armies of additional union staff get employed to introduce government initiatives, but obviously we do pivot our kind of policy work accordingly to ensure our reps have support. Trade unions are, those who act on behalf of trade unions are the worker representatives. So in terms of our capacity, it's going to come down to the people we can get on the ground to come forward to take part in the work meaningfully. It's not about funneling down more people from the top. It's actually getting that worker voice from the bottom into the structures at an employer level. And that's why I made the points earlier about enabling people to have time to do that and to adequately prepare.
Neil?
So I think when we looked at the regulatory impact appraisal for the legislation, the potential big cost we identified, probably nobody would be surprised to learn, was in relation to the procurement duties and the contract management duties in particular. In relation to the other duties in social partnership working, I think the fundamental view of my ministers is that if public bodies are not already behaving in this way, then they damn well ought to be. And so partnership working is already deeply embedded in Wales. This gives it a new slant, perhaps, gives it a new emphasis. And for some bodies, as I said earlier, it might be a bit of a steeper climb than others. But we expect public bodies already to be working very closely with their staff and with their trade unions. And this gives perhaps just a new focus to that. It's not a new development by any means. Sarah touched earlier on the excellent partnership working within NHS Wales. I spoke last week at the NHS Wales Social Partnership Forum. And that is probably, I think, by common agreement amongst myself and my colleagues, the strongest, the best performing social partnership structure that we have at Welsh Government level in terms of sector-based structures. So there's lots of examples of really good practice, and we don't think what we've set out in the legislation is overly onerous on public bodies. I do think the challenge is primarily for our trade union colleagues, because they'll be stepping into a new space that they won't necessarily have occupied before.
Yeah, thanks very much, Neil. Sarah, reflections on the question and what's been said so far?
Yeah, so I would agree with what's been said. I think some of it's about time, some of it's about making sure that the infrastructure is embedded throughout the organisation. So, we've quite very strong at a senior level, but we know we need to do more work at other levels, hence setting up those divisional partnership forums, letting people know who's who. And I think it's just about sharing the message, isn't it, at every opportunity, making sure that we embed that across our planning work and all of the work that we do collectively.
Well, thanks very much, all, and some good pointers in the legislation and in comments people made about the importance of good communication and early engagement in any decisions that organisations are making. A slightly different question now, relating to national organisations that have offices in Wales. What should they be doing in terms of social partnership and embedding them within their organisations? And I don't mind who I go to first. Probably I should have pointed towards somebody, actually. I'll go to Jess first, if that's okay.
I was going to point you to Neil.
Neil.
Thank you, Jess. I think the key point to note, of course, is that our legislation only affects devolved functions and devolved public bodies.
Yeah.
So those public bodies who perform functions which are not devolved are not touched by this legislation. Yes. I'm sure my ministers would have the very same ambitions for those public bodies, but they're not under our control. We don't manage them and we don't give them direction in the same way. Yeah. One of the things about this act is that although our ambition has been limited by the Senedd's ability to legislate in this area, that by no means suggests that my minister's ambitions in relation to social partnership are limited just to this legislation and just to what we can do within public bodies. Not least, we would hope that the model we've set out here, assuming we can make it a real success, might act as a primer and a bit of a motivator to spread the good word about social partnership and its potential impact beyond the public sector, beyond devolved public bodies, into the private sector. We had a question I've tried to answer in the chat bar about SMEs, for instance. We very much hope that this is a model which, proven successful, could be looked at and adopted by others. We're already beginning to see in further education, for instance, some interesting models developing, not by any kind of push by Welsh Government, but simply because some of those colleges are recognising for themselves the potential in this way of working.
Any reflections, Sarah or Jess, on this one?
Just very quickly on that. Yeah, I think it's that there is the social partnership legislation, and then there is the idea of social partnership. And I suppose it's you know, anyone can adopt the ethos.
Excellent. Thanks. That takes us quite well into the next question around adopting the ethos. We've heard from Sarah, who works for a very large organisation, and we know ultimately the legislation is targeted towards larger public sector bodies. But any tips from any of you, I suppose, practical tips really for embedding the principles for small micro businesses, people employing 10 people or less? And I'll go to Sarah first, as I picked on Jess last time.
It's quite difficult for me to think to answer. I've never worked for a small company in that respect, but you know, initially my thoughts would be the principles are the same, aren't they, in terms of whether your organisation is large or small, and it's just about finding and what works for you.
Yes.
So if you're in that position where you are keen to work in social partnership, to start the conversation, I would say, with those you'll be working in social partnership to, and have a good understanding of what your shared objectives would look like and how we would want that to work practically. I think it would look very different. You know, I described quite a formalised governance structure. You know, it wouldn't need to look that formalised, my understanding is, and I don't think that would suit a smaller employer. So it's just about really identifying how it works for you and making sure that you continually talk and review if things are working or not. I think that's something we do, even though with, you know, a larger employer, is making sure that we continually talk to our trade union leads, and not just me. That goes for our chief executive and our chair. So making sure those channels are open at all times.
No, thanks very much. That's really helpful. The thoughts of embedding the principles even in the smallest of teams. Neil or Jess, anything to add to that? We've got about, sorry, Neil, go on. We've got about 3 minutes left, so just a final reminder to anybody for questions in the sidebar. But Neil, over to you.
I'll try and keep it brief then. I can see Richard's followed up with a question specifically about public sector contracts. Richard, if it would be helpful, I'm very happy to put you in touch with our procurement people who are developing all of the guidance and the kind of model contract clauses on the socially responsible procurement side, so that you can perhaps become involved in that work. I think mention of the principles is absolutely right. What we've put out in the legislation is one form of social partnership, but it's an expression of the values and the principles which are about partnership working, which are about shared respect, which are about shared vision, which are about kind of a collaborative effort, and a commitment to finding joint solutions, often to difficult problems. You can see that those principles forming. I will do, Richard. Thank you. Forming a way of working with any enterprise, however large or small. And if you think about, say, lean methodology in a manufacturing environment or whatever, absolutely core to that is the idea of working closely with your staff in order to inform your thinking about how your organization performs, where you can achieve improvements, where you can deliver productivity gains. And this is almost another expression of that idea as well. So I think it has application very widely in whatever context, but it needs to be context specific to make it work.
Yeah, thanks very much. And apologies, I'm not able to see the questions in the sidebar. So if thanks, Neil, for picking that one up. And if any of my colleagues from the Welsh NHS Confed spot one that I haven't answered, but I've still got the two, even after refreshing. Was there any that I missed, colleagues, or anything we wanted to cover in final questions? No, thanks very much for a really, really good session. Great to hear the background from you, Neil, the legislation and the ambition of what the legislation is trying to achieve. The union perspective from Jess, Sarah, what you had to say again, chime in what you've both said really, is the principles have been there for some time. It's putting it on a statutory basis, but always think about how we can do it even better. And I think that's been the theme of a lot of the conversations. There's always room for improvement where, however well we're doing it, listening, engaging and making staff part of the decision-making process. So thanks very much all for your contributions today. And if people do have questions that weren't covered today, please do contact us and we'll forward them to the speakers today. So thanks all to you once again. As I mentioned at the start, we've got another webinar planned on the 12th of December. We've got some really excited speakers from Welsh Government, from the Welsh NHS and from the Race and Health Observatory, talking about embedding equality and inclusion across all organisations. So that'll be another great event. If you do think there's something that'd be interesting to cover in this sort of forum, please do email myself or colleagues across the team with any ideas. Follow us on our events page if you'd like to see what else we're involved with, and on Twitter at Welsh Confed. So thanks all to our speakers, to my team here at Welsh NHS Confederation for pulling the event together today, and for all of you for your support in attending. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Darren.
Thanks all.
Everyone.